Let's talk a bit about some basic theory. So I made a little list that shows how age affects materials. And the three main components of the material are diffuse, reflection, and bump. And let's look at how each of those maps are affected by age, weather, wear and tear, and so on. So let's start with the diffuse. The diffuse can get dirty, it can have some grime on it, it can develop some patina in occluded areas, it can get some dust settling on top of the object. There can also be some green growth on the areas of the object that are exposed to rain or water. So you can also get some discolorations either from sun or from water. You can get some leaks coming from the top, some splashes coming from the bottom, and some fading of the color from the UV rays. Right, so the reflections can get dirtier. There can be some dirt and grime on top of the object that blocks the reflections. And usually objects lose their glossiness with age as well. And they lose their perfect polish and become a bit blurrier into reflections. Okay, so some areas become less reflective, some areas stay the same, so you get this slightly patchy look. And you can also get some smears and smudges in the reflections from some sort of human contact with the object. If you touch a shiny glass, you're gonna get some fingerprints on it and smudges from the oils in your skin. So this can show in the reflections. Refractions also display similar effects to the reflections. Right, and for the bump you have some basic surface damage, some dents, some scratches, some chips, and you have some more damage around the edges where the most wear happens for the object. And you also get some distortions of the whole object. Basically, if it starts out flat and straight out of the factory, with age it can become slightly buckled, slightly wavy, and distorted a little bit. Right, and then you have the layered materials, which are basically composed from multiple simple materials. So let's say you have lacquered wood, you have the wood material and lacquer on top, and perhaps even some dirt on top of that lacquer. So for those layered materials, each layer is aged with these same techniques, and the damaged areas usually show through the lower layer, and you can also get some dirt and mud layers on top of the object. Alright, so this is a simplified diagram of my workflow. So the first thing I do is I analyze some reference photos. And always find some reference photos for the material you're trying to recreate, so you can get them from Google or go out and take the photos yourself, because it's very hard to get realistic result if you do not have some reference to work from. And this is how I break down these reference images in my head. So first of all, I look if the material is simple or if it's layered. And layered material is usually something that has significant changes in multiple properties of the material. So for example, it has different levels of reflection, different glossiness, different diffuse, and also if the material has different types of speculars in the same place. For example, you have sharp reflections and blurry reflections at the same time in one area of the object. This material must be layered, otherwise you can't really get this effect. Okay, so if the material is layered, just break it down into layers and then one by one start with the first layer and break it down into maps. If the material is simple, you just break it down into maps right away. So try to figure out how the diffuse, reflection, refraction and bump maps should look. And for each map, try to find some generic patterns that are repeated all over the object, and the geometry specific patterns that are concentrated along the edges, for example, or patina concentrated in the occluded areas or concave areas. And then I create or choose masks to create those patterns. And then I take those masks and mix and composite them together to create my final map. And sometimes I do this step in Photoshop if the desired map is very complex or it's simply faster to do in Photoshop. And then I move on to the next map. So let's say I start by diffuse, I create the map, move on to reflection, create the map, move on to glossiness, create the map, move on to bump, create the map, and so on. Once all the maps are finished, I just go to the next layer and do it all over again. And finally, I mix them together by using the final mask that is used for the V-Ray blend material. Now let's talk about masks. And these are black and white patterns that are used with mix maps, composite maps, and V-Ray blend materials. And masks are very important in my workflow. So basically what we do is we use a pattern to blend together two colors, maps, or materials. So here's an example of blending together two colors, green and red, using this black and white image as a mask. And this is the final result. As you can see, the black areas show the first color and the white areas show the second color. And all the grays in between show a mix of those two colors. So you can calculate the exact amount of each color used by some simple mathematical formulas, but I'm not going to get into that right now because this is pretty intuitive, and you can just increase the brightness if you want more reds and make it darker if you want more greens. So it's very simple. And keep in mind you can use these masks to blend not only colors but maps, textures, or even materials. Okay, so the masks can be categorized in three categories. So you have your bitmaps, which are photos or hand-painted images adjusted in Photoshop to create the black and white tileable versions of them. Here's an example. Okay, next you have procedural maps, which are mathematically generated in 3D Max. And there's one advantage to these, that they do not need UVW coordinates for your object. You can just use them without unwrapping the model or even using any sort of UV mapping, and they still work fine. Some examples are maps like noise, cellular, wave. Okay, and next you have the geometry specific masks. And these masks are generated from the 3D model of your object in 3D Max or V-Ray when the rendering is happening. So these are pretty useful. So let's look at some examples of geometry specific masks. So the first one is ambient occlusion or VRAYDIRT. So basically with the default settings, with the exception of swapping the colors around, you get the occlusion effect in the occluded areas that are basically inner edges that do not get as much light as the rest of the object. And you can also use it with inverted normals, which gives another very useful effect, but instead this effect is applied on the outer edges or the outer corners of the object. And you can also use the bias values of the VRAYDIRT to kind of shift the dirt effect in any of the 6 directions: up, down, left, right, forward, backward. There is one disadvantage to VRAYDIRT, and it's that it cannot be used in the bump slot for now. if you use any map with VRAYDIRT in it in the bump slot, the bump is simply not going to be calculated at all. So perhaps that will be fixed in the future, but for now, just keep that in mind. And VRAYDIRT is very useful for adding some patina, dirt, edge wear, leaks from the top, some water soaking up from the bottom, and stuff like that. Okay, so our next map is FALLOFF. And with aged, old and dirty materials, the way I use it is I set it to towards away and use it on the world Z axis. And this way I can apply this effect on those areas of the object that are exposed, for example, towards the top. So imagine just rain falling down on the object, and you can get a mask in those areas where it would touch the object. So basically all those surfaces that are facing upwards. And you can use it with inverted colors for generating the same effect, but on the bottom. And this can be great for adding some dust settling on top, some wet areas on top, some moss or algae growing in these wet areas, and maybe some splashes coming up from the bottom only on those areas that are facing downwards. So it's a pretty useful map as well. Okay, so next one is the curvature map. And you have to use a little plugin to create it in 3D Max. I'm going to show you that a bit later. But basically what it does, it generates the colors for convex areas. So the convex areas are green. You can control the intensity and the contrast of these colors as well. And it generates a red color for the concave areas. And even though this map is not on black and white, it is used with vertex color map, which you can further split into red, green and blue channels and use each channel as a mask. So for example, if you set it to red channel and red becomes white, the green disappears and you can use it for the concave areas. Or if you set the channel to green, you can use the convex areas of this map. So it's pretty useful, basically two maps in one. Okay, and it can be great for adding some patina, some edge wear, or some fading of the color in the convex areas, some more polish in the most worn areas. Like if you would handle this teapot, you would probably mostly hold it on those convex areas. It's great for making those a bit shinier and more worn. Okay, so next one is not strictly generated from the geometry of the object, but I still included it in this geometry specific list, and it's a gradient. And basically sometimes you have the materials that should have a different look on different sides of the material of the object. So what I usually do is I apply a new planar UVW map to my object, set it to a different channel than the default one, and basically use it only for this gradient mask. And you can add some various effects. For example, you can add some dirt on the bottom or on the left or the right, whichever place you need it. And all these masks, all these geometry specific masks are too perfect, and they look very CG, and they do not look too natural. So that's why they are almost never used with the default settings, and they usually mix them or composite them with some other masks like procedurals or bitmaps to create the final mask, which looks much more natural than this one on the left. So you have this FALLOFF here, and I've mixed it with a bitmap, and the white areas show the bitmap, and the black areas just stay black. You can get some very interesting effects this way, and the masks look much better and are much more useful with some little tweaking.